The snow fell thick and slow outside the window, frosting the edges of Manhattan like some old-fashioned Christmas card. I stood there, one hand resting lightly against the cool glass, watching the city blur into a soft white dream. My name is Miles Harrington, and if you had asked me that morning, I would have told you that my life was exactly what I'd always wanted. A beautiful apartment high above the noise, a family who made the walls feel alive, and a holiday gathering just hours away that promised laughter, warmth, and the kind of memories you tuck carefully away to keep yourself steady during the long gray months of the new year. But even as I stood there, soaking it all in, a tightness pulled in my chest, sharp and insistent, like a warning I couldn't quite hear. Behind me, Claudia's voice rose in a musical hum as she fussed with the decorations, her stockinged feet making soft shuffling sounds across the hardwood floors. Our son Noah, just 8 years old and vibrating with Christmas Eve excitement, darted back and forth between the kitchen and the living room, carrying ornaments like precious jewels. "Careful, buddy," I called over my shoulder, smiling. His dark hair stuck up at odd angles, and he had chocolate smudged across one cheek from sneaking cookies when he thought no one was looking. Claudia laughed when she saw him, wiping his face clean with a napkin before handing him another ornament, her eyes dancing with that familiar mix of amusement and exasperation that made me love her all over again. We had built this life deliberately, layer by layer, memory by memory, determined to make something different from the cold, fractured families we had grown up in. Christmas was sacred to us, not because of religion or tradition, but because it was ours, a celebration of what we had chosen to create. And this year was no different. Or so I thought. We were expecting Claudia's family the next morning for Christmas breakfast, her sister Rachel, Rachel's husband Bryce, their son Logan, and, of course, Eleanor, Claudia's mother. I glanced at the neatly set dining table, the crystal glasses catching the warm light from the chandelier, the silverware polished until it gleamed. Claudia had outdone herself, as she always did, making sure every detail was perfect, every small comfort accounted for. She wanted this to be magical for Noah, for all of us. Still, that unease scratched at the edges of my mind. I tried to push it away, blaming it on holiday stress, the pressure of hosting, the thousand tiny worries that came with wanting everything to go just right. But it was more than that. It was the way the snow seemed to fall too quietly, the way the city lights flickered and dimmed beneath the heavy clouds. It was something I couldn't name yet, but it sat heavy in my chest, thick and immovable. I turned away from the window and crossed the room to where Claudia was adjusting the centerpiece on the table, a lush arrangement of evergreens, pine cones, and red berries. She looked up at me, her smile instant and bright, the kind of smile that still made my heart trip after all these years. "Are you okay?" she asked, brushing a stray lock of hair behind her ear. "Yeah," I lied easily, wrapping my arms around her waist and pulling her close. She smelled like vanilla and cinnamon, warm and familiar. Just thinking about how lucky we are. It wasn't entirely a lie. Even with the weight pressing on my chest, looking at her, at the home we had built, I felt a fierce, protective kind of gratitude. Whatever that whisper of unease was, it couldn't touch us here. Not in this place we had made sacred. Noah came barreling toward us, holding up a lopsided star ornament he had made at school. "Look, Daddy, can we put it on the tree now?" Claudia laughed and kissed the top of his head. "Of course, sweetheart. Let's do it together." We knelt together by the towering fir tree, its branches heavy with gold and silver ornaments, twinkling lights weaving through like fireflies caught in green. Noah insisted on placing the star himself, his tongue poking out in concentration as he balanced precariously on tiptoes. Claudia held his waist to steady him, and I stood behind them, feeling something almost painful in the tenderness of the moment. These were the memories I wanted him to carry into adulthood. The warmth of family, the knowledge that he was loved beyond measure. Later, after Noah had been tucked into bed, his small form curled beneath a mountain of blankets, Claudia and I sat together on the couch, sipping mulled wine and listening to the city hum below us. She rested her head on my shoulder, and for a while, we said nothing, just breathing in the peace of it all. I ran my fingers through her hair absently, feeling the soft thrum of her heartbeat against my side. "Tomorrow's going to be wonderful," she murmured, her voice thick with sleep. "Yeah," I said softly, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "It will be." I meant it. I wanted to believe it with every part of me. But even as I whispered those words into her hair, the snow kept falling outside, heavier now, muffling the world in white silence. And deep inside me, something shifted. Something fragile and unseen cracked, like the first hairline fracture in a piece of glass. I didn't know it yet, but our perfect world had already begun to break. And by the time the sun rose over Manhattan the next morning, nothing would ever be the same again. Christmas morning broke bright and cold, the kind of crisp winter day that almost made you forget the city never truly slept. Sunlight bounced off rooftops dusted in white, and from somewhere far below, the muted sounds of life stirred, honking taxis, the metallic hiss of snowplows clearing the streets. But inside our apartment, it was still, almost sacred, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath in anticipation. I woke to the sound of little feet pounding across the floorboards, and before I could even open my eyes, Noah launched himself onto the bed. "It's Christmas. Wake up! Wake up!" he crowed, his hands shaking my arm, his excitement vibrating through the mattress. Claudia groaned sleepily beside me, pulling the covers over her head with a soft laugh. All right, we're up," I said, reaching for Noah and hauling him into a hug, his giggles muffled against my chest. His joy was contagious, washing away the heavy thoughts that had haunted me the night before. Today would be good. It had to be. We pulled on our robes and slippers, padding into the living room where the tree waited, regal and sparkling. Presents spilled out beneath it, wrapped in shiny paper and glossy bows, a chaotic rainbow of Christmas magic. Claudia disappeared into the kitchen, calling over her shoulder that she needed to get the cinnamon rolls into the oven before our guests arrived. I watched Noah circle the tree like a hawk, his small fingers itching to dive into the presents, but his good manners, barely, keeping him in check. By 9 o'clock, just as the first delicious smells of baking filled the apartment, the doorbell chimed. Noah sprinted for the door before I could stop him, yanking it open with both hands. "Merry Christmas!" he shouted into the hallway. Rachel and Bryce stood there, bundled in heavy coats, their son Logan bouncing on the balls of his feet beside them, a Santa hat slipping over his eyes. Behind them came Eleanor, wrapped in a heavy fur coat, a sharp smile already pasted onto her face. Their arms were loaded with brightly wrapped packages, the kind that screamed department store perfection. "Look who it is," Claudia called cheerfully, wiping her hands on a dish towel as she hurried over. She hugged Rachel tightly, kissed Eleanor on the cheek, and ruffled Logan's hair affectionately. I followed, offering Bryce a handshake and Rachel a warm if cautious smile. As we ushered them inside, I caught the way Rachel's eyes darted around our apartment, taking in the tasteful decorations, the warm lighting, the view of the snow-blanketed skyline through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Her smile faltered slightly, the edges tightening before she quickly masked it again. Eleanor, too, gave a slow, sweeping glance across the living room, her expression as chilly as the air outside. Her eyes snagged on every little thing, on the new sectional sofa Claudia had picked out, on the hand-woven rug, on the shimmering crystal ornaments on the tree. "Charming," Eleanor said with a nod that was anything but complimentary. I clenched my jaw but said nothing, exchanging a quick glance with Claudia, who gave me a small, almost imperceptible shake of her head. "Let it go," that look said. "It's Christmas." We posed for photos in front of the tree, forced smiles, arms around each other in stiff embraces. Logan and Noah grinned genuinely enough, their excitement overpowering the tension the adults were trying and failing to hide. Rachel draped an arm around Claudia, flashing a wide, dazzling smile just as Bryce snapped the picture, but the way her fingers dug into Claudia's shoulder made my stomach twist. Once the obligatory photos were over, we settled into the living room. Bryce passed around mugs of hot cocoa, spiked discreetly with a little something extra for the adults. Claudia kept busy in the kitchen, flitting in and out with trays of pastries and fresh fruit, her laughter bright but brittle. I watched her carefully, noting the way her hands trembled ever so slightly when she thought no one was looking. The air was heavy, oppressive, the kind of invisible weight you could almost choke on. Every smile was a little too sharp, every laugh a little too loud. I told myself it was holiday stress, the usual family friction heightened by the expectations we piled onto these days. I told myself it would pass once the presents were opened and the mimosas started flowing. But some small, stubborn part of me whispered otherwise. Noah and Logan were already bouncing in front of the tree, desperate to begin the gift exchange. Claudia glanced at me, her smile tight, and gave a small nod. "All right, boys," she said, "let's get started." I leaned back against the arm of the sofa, cocoa warming my hands, and watched as Rachel handed Logan the first gift, a shiny red package almost as big as he was. Logan tore into it with abandon, shrieking with delight as he unearthed the latest iPhone model, complete with a glittering silver case. "Best aunt and uncle ever," Rachel declared loudly, raising her cup in a mock toast. Claudia laughed, but there was a strain in her voice that only I seemed to hear. I squeezed her hand briefly, grounding her, grounding myself. Next came Noah's turn. His eyes were huge, shining with anticipation as he carefully peeled away the wrapping paper on a small, elegant box labeled, "To Noah, with love, from Aunt Rachel and Grandma Eleanor." Inside was a sleek, silver smartwatch, gleaming under the twinkling lights. Noah's face lit up, pure, unfiltered joy radiating from him. He turned the watch over in his small hands, admiring the screen, the band, the way it caught the light. "Wow," he breathed, looking up at us with the kind of wonder that made every sacrifice worth it. But then, a flicker. A shadow passed over his face so quickly I almost missed it. His smile faltered. His eyes grew glassy. He swayed slightly on his feet. And then, in a horrifying, slow-motion tumble, Noah collapsed to the floor. The sound of Noah's body hitting the floor was sharper than anything I'd ever heard, a crack of reality shattering through the soft, idyllic haze we had tried so carefully to create. For one frozen second, no one moved. It was as if the whole room had been yanked underwater, the world muffled and distorted. Then the panic slammed into me, shattering the stillness. I was on my knees before I even realized it, sliding across the hardwood to reach him. Noah. His name tore from my throat, raw and desperate. His small body convulsed, his arms jerking uncontrollably. His smartwatch-clad wrist twitched violently against the floor. I tried to lift him, to cradle his head in my lap. But Claudia was there too, scrambling beside me, her hands fluttering helplessly over our son's trembling body. The room exploded into movement behind us. Rachel let out a high-pitched gasp, clutching Bryce's arm. Logan started crying, his small face crumpling in confusion and fear. I heard Eleanor's voice. A brittle, mocking laugh slicing through the chaos, and my head snapped up. Maybe that was a little too exciting. Eleanor said lightly, dabbing the corners of her mouth with a napkin as if she were watching a particularly amusing theater performance. Something inside me went white-hot. My vision tunneled. I stared at her, really stared, and for the first time, I saw her without the mask of politeness we had all pretended was real. Her smile wasn't concerned or embarrassed. It was satisfied. Smug. Rachel leaned close to Bryce, whispering something I couldn't quite hear, but I caught enough. Now that's a real surprise, in the smirk that twisted her mouth immediately after. I turned back to Noah, forcing myself to focus. His body was jerking less now, but his eyes were still rolled back, and a thin sheen of sweat coated his forehead. I pressed trembling fingers to his temple, feeling the weak flutter of his pulse. "Call an ambulance." Claudia screamed, her voice nearly shattering with fear. Bryce fumbled with his phone, hand shaking, muttering to the 911 operator. I stroked Noah's hair back gently, murmuring soothing nonsense I wasn't even sure he could hear. "I've got you, buddy. I'm right here. Daddy's right here." My voice cracked, and I bit down hard on the surge of terror rising in my throat. Every second stretched unbearably long, the ticking of the wall clock pounding against my skull like a drum. From the corner of my eye, I caught movement, Eleanor settling back into her chair, crossing her legs with a bored sigh. Rachel stood awkwardly beside her, shifting from foot to foot, her eyes flickering between Claudia's frantic sobs and the twitching body of my son, as if debating whether she should look more upset. I wanted to scream, to lunge across the room and tear away their masks of civility. But all I could do was hold on to Noah and wait for help to arrive. The seconds dragged. Bryce barked into the phone, giving our address, demanding someone hurry. Logan sat on the floor near the tree, forgotten presents scattered around him like debris from some terrible storm. His lower lip trembled, silent tears streaking his cheeks. Claudia kept whispering Noah's name over and over, her hands gripping his arm like a lifeline. I couldn't tear my eyes away from our son's face, desperate for any sign that he was coming back to us. His breathing was shallow but steady now, the violent spasms easing into small, erratic twitches. Finally, mercifully, I heard the distant wail of sirens cutting through the snowy morning. I glanced toward the window, saw the flicker of red and blue lights bouncing off the neighboring buildings. Relief and terror collided inside me, leaving me dizzy. "Help's here," I said hoarsely, squeezing Claudia's shoulder. She nodded, blinking rapidly, trying to gather herself as two EMTs burst through the door a moment later, their bright uniforms surreal against the cozy backdrop of our ruined Christmas morning. They moved with brisk efficiency, checking Noah's vitals, fitting an oxygen mask over his small face, asking clipped, urgent questions we struggled to answer. One of the EMTs gently pried Noah from my arms, laying him on a stretcher with careful hands. Possible seizure, the female EMT said to her partner. Get him loaded. We need to move fast. Claudia clutched Noah's hand, refusing to let go even as they wheeled him toward the door. I stumbled after them, my heart hammering against my ribs, half aware of the others still standing frozen in the living room. Rachel stood with her arms wrapped tightly around herself, her face pale. Bryce hovered awkwardly at her side, his hand resting on Logan's shoulder. Eleanor remained seated, legs crossed neatly, watching the scene unfold with an expression so devoid of humanity it chilled me more than the winter air pouring in from the open door. As I followed the stretcher into the hall, I turned and locked eyes with her. For one horrifying moment, Eleanor smiled at me, small, smug, deliberate. And I knew. Whatever had just happened to my son wasn't an accident. It wasn't fate or bad luck. It was something far darker, something cruel and calculated. I had no proof yet. No evidence I could shove into someone's hands and demand justice with. But that smile, that horrible, knowing smile, was enough. The elevator doors slid open with a ding, and we rushed inside, the stretcher barely fitting. I stood pressed against the wall, gripping the side rail with white knuckles, staring down at Noah's pale face. Claudia kept whispering to him, stroking his hair, promising he was going to be okay. I wanted to believe her. I needed to believe her. But even as we descended toward the lobby, sirens already cutting a path through the slush-clogged streets, I felt the first real fracture of certainty crack open inside me. The world I thought I knew was slipping away, piece by piece. And deep down, some terrible part of me already understood. This was only the beginning. For a moment after Noah collapsed, the room stood still, suspended in a horrible, unnatural silence. The kind of silence that doesn't come from peace but from something rupturing deep inside, leaving a hollow space in its wake. I knelt there, frozen, feeling the weight of my son's limp body in my arms. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. And then, through that unbearable quiet, I heard it. A laugh. It sliced through the room like a razor, high and brittle and cruel. I turned my head slowly, disbelieving, almost afraid to see what I already knew I would find. Eleanor. She sat primly on the edge of the couch, a napkin daintily pressed to her lips as if she were hiding a smile, though the effort was thin and useless. Maybe that was a little too exciting, she said, her voice light, almost playful, as if this horror unfolding at our feet, was nothing more than a mildly inappropriate magic trick. I stared at her, my mind blank with shock, my hand still cradling Noah's tiny hand. Claudia let out a soft whimper beside me, her eyes huge and brimming with tears. Before I could even form a word, another voice joined the moment like a poison thread woven into the air. Rachel leaned toward Bryce, her mouth close to his ear, but not so close that I missed it. Not so quiet that it wasn't meant to be heard. Now that's a real surprise, she whispered, a smirk playing at the corner of her mouth. Real surprise. The words echoed in my skull, bouncing around wildly until they blurred into something raw and furious. I felt my face heat, my blood pounding so loudly in my ears I barely heard the wail of sirens approaching from far below. I focused on Noah. That had to be my anchor. Not them. Not the sharp cruelty smirking across the living room. Noah, still breathing shallowly beneath my fingertips, still fighting somewhere in that tiny, trembling body. I bent lower, pressing my forehead lightly against his, willing my strength into him, begging silently, fiercely. Hold on, buddy. Just hold on. Claudia wiped at Noah's face with the edge of her sleeve, whispering his name over and over, her voice cracking apart like glass. I wanted to gather her up too, to shield them both from this nightmare, but I had no idea how. Everything was spinning, and the ground beneath my knees felt as unstable as if it were about to collapse completely. The elevator doors dinged at the end of the hall, and then the EMTs burst in, a blur of navy uniforms and efficient, barking orders. They swarmed around Noah, lifting him gently, securing him with brisk, professional care. One of them asked Claudia if Noah had a history of seizures. She shook her head violently, unable to form words, and I forced my throat to work enough to croak out, "Never. He's never had anything like this before." The male EMT nodded grimly, already examining the smartwatch still strapped to Noah's wrist. His brow furrowed briefly, but he said nothing, just moved faster. That watch. My stomach twisted. "Sir, we need to transport him now," the woman EMT said urgently, and without waiting for permission, they wheeled Noah's stretcher toward the door. I stood, stumbling slightly, feeling rooted between two worlds, the life we had been living and whatever terrible new one we had just been shoved into. Bryce shifted uncomfortably, his hand resting on Logan's small, trembling shoulder. The boy looked utterly terrified, wide-eyed and silent. Rachel, still clinging to her mug of cocoa like it might anchor her to innocence, refused to meet my gaze. And Eleanor, God, Eleanor, just sat there, her eyes glinting with something dark and satisfied. I caught up to the stretcher, Claudia clutching Noah's free hand as they guided him into the elevator. I hesitated at the threshold, the last one out of the apartment. I turned back, demanding to understand what had just happened. But no one offered any explanation. No one moved to stop me. And that, somehow, was worse than any shouted confession. As the elevator doors slid closed, cutting me off from the apartment, I realized with bone-deep certainty that whatever had just taken root in our lives wasn't going to be easily pulled out. It was buried too deep, fed by too many years of hidden resentments and masked cruelties. The ride down was a blur. Claudia wept quietly, her head bowed over Noah's still form. I stood frozen, one hand braced against the wall, my mind ricocheting wildly between fury, fear, and the cold mechanical need to stay standing for my family. When the doors opened onto the lobby, a rush of cold air hit us, carrying the sharp metallic scent of snow and city grit. The ambulance sat waiting just outside, red and blue lights painting the marble walls in pulsing color. The EMTs loaded Noah quickly, Claudia climbing into the back without hesitation. As the doors slammed shut behind them, I ran for the front passenger seat, heart hammering, lungs burning. As we pulled into the street, tires screeching slightly on the slush, I twisted in my seat to watch Claudia stroke Noah's hair, her face a portrait of raw, unfiltered agony. I turned back around, staring blindly at the windshield, barely registering the blurring cityscape as we hurtled toward the hospital. Behind my eyes, the images played over and over. Eleanor's laugh, Rachel's smirk, Noah's small body jerking uncontrollably against the floor. And above all of it, a growing, undeniable certainty blooming inside me like a poison flower. This wasn't an accident. It was an attack, and it had come from the people we had welcomed into our home. Trusted, loved. As we sped toward the unknown, my jaw clenched so hard it ached, and I made a silent vow. No matter how deep this betrayal went, no matter how many lies had to be torn apart to find the truth, I would not stop. I would find out exactly what they had done, and they would answer for it. The ambulance lights painted the snow in frantic flashes of red and blue as we tore through Manhattan's half-awake streets. I sat stiffly in the front seat, every muscle locked so tight it hurt to breathe. My fingers curled into fists against my thighs, nails biting into skin through the fabric of my jeans, but it didn't even register. All I could focus on was the soft murmur of Claudia's voice from the back, her desperate reassurances to Noah, and the occasional barked medical updates from the paramedics. I stole glances over my shoulder whenever I could. Noah was so still, his small chest rising and falling under the oxygen mask, his face pale against the rumpled bedding of the stretcher. Claudia leaned over him, brushing his hair back again and again, whispering his name like it was a spell that could hold him here, tether him to us. I wanted to believe it would work. I needed to believe it. The city rushed past in a blur of icy gray and slush. Storefronts, flashing traffic lights, people bundled in coats trudging along sidewalks. They all slid past without meaning. Time itself felt different inside that speeding ambulance, thick and sluggish, as if we were trapped in a moment stretched too thin. The male EMT in the back, the younger of the two, was fiddling with something in his hands. It caught my eye, a flash of silver against his blue gloves. Noah's smartwatch. My stomach twisted hard enough to make me nauseous. I turned to face front again, trying to keep my thoughts steady, trying not to jump to conclusions. But it was impossible not to remember Eleanor's smile, Rachel's whisper, the way the smartwatch had gleamed so innocently in Noah's palm just before he collapsed. The hospital loomed into view, a squat, sprawling building with floodlights glaring harshly against the snow. The ambulance jerked to a stop near the emergency entrance, and the back doors flew open as more medical staff rushed toward us. I scrambled out of the front seat, running around just in time to help guide the stretcher inside. Everything moved so fast. Voices shouting orders. Stretchers and wheelchairs cluttering the hallway. The sharp chemical sting of antiseptic in the air. Claudia's hand was still wrapped around Noah's, refusing to let go even as nurses gently tried to guide her aside to give the doctors room to work. "Mrs. Harrington, please, we need space to assess him," a nurse said, not unkindly. Claudia's eyes darted wildly to me, desperate. I stepped forward and touched her arm. "Let them help him, Claude," I said gently, even though it tore at me to do it. Slowly, reluctantly, she loosened her grip, backing away only enough to let the team swarm around Noah. They pushed his stretcher through a set of swinging doors, leaving us stranded there in the corridor. I caught Claudia as she sagged against me, wrapping my arms around her trembling frame. "He's going to be okay," I whispered fiercely, pressing my face into her hair. "He's strong. He's going to be okay." I didn't know if it was true, but I had to believe it. For both of us. An older nurse with kind eyes approached, guiding us gently toward a small waiting area. It was little more than a cluster of uncomfortable chairs and a coffee machine that gurgled and sputtered into an empty carafe. Claudia sat down heavily, her hands twisting the hem of her sweater. I couldn't sit. I paced the small room like a caged animal, rage and helplessness warring inside me. I kept seeing it over and over, Noah collapsing, Eleanor laughing, Rachel smirking. What had they done? The younger EMT, the one who'd been examining the smartwatch, came into the waiting room, his face drawn tight with something I couldn't immediately read. Worry, suspicion, maybe both. In his gloved hands, he held the device carefully, like it might still be dangerous. "Sir," he said, addressing me directly, "the doctors are working on stabilizing your son. They'll update you as soon as they can. But I thought you should know. There's something unusual about the watch he was wearing." I moved toward him so fast it startled him back a step. "What do you mean unusual?" He hesitated, glancing toward Claudia, then back to me. "It's better if the attending physician explains. But there's definitely something not right." I nodded tightly, not trusting myself to speak. Minutes, or maybe hours, time had lost all meaning, passed before a tall, serious-looking doctor approached us. He introduced himself as Dr. Patel, but I barely caught the name, too focused on the grave look on his face. "We need to talk," he said quietly, motioning for us to follow him. Claudia grabbed my hand instinctively, and we walked together down the hall, our steps echoing in the sterile silence. He led us into a small consultation room, closing the door behind us. "Dr. Patel pulled up Noah's preliminary scans on the screen, a tangled web of brainwaves that made no sense to me. "There's no structural damage," he said. "No sign of a stroke or injury. But the electrical activity in his brain is abnormal, highly irregular." He placed the smartwatch on the table carefully, almost reverently. We opened the device. "It's been tampered with." Hidden inside was a small emitter, low frequency, designed to trigger a neurological response. In this case, a seizure. My heart stopped. I literally felt it pause, like my body refused to believe the words. "It wasn't an accident," Dr. Patel said, his voice low, almost apologetic. "It was designed to do this. To hurt him." I stared at the watch, at its gleaming, innocent face, and felt something inside me collapse. "Call the police," Dr. Patel said. Immediately. Hours blurred into each other, a haze of fluorescent lights, muffled announcements over the hospital intercom, and the metallic tang of fear that never left my tongue. Claudia and I sat side by side in the small waiting area outside the ICU, our hands clasped so tightly it hurt. Neither of us spoke much. What could we say? Every few minutes Claudia would jerk upright at the sound of approaching footsteps, her face hopeful, desperate, only to sag when it wasn't a doctor bringing news. I kept staring at the closed double doors that separated us from Noah, willing them to open, willing someone to tell me my son was safe. But the minutes dragged like anchors tied around our chests, suffocating and relentless. Finally, the doors creaked open and Dr. Patel appeared, his face grim under the harsh fluorescent lights. He carried himself with a kind of tired gravity that immediately crushed any foolish hope I had been nursing. Something was wrong. He motioned for us to follow him without a word, and we rose on legs that barely remembered how to work. Claudia's hand clutched at my jacket, and I wrapped my arm around her shoulders, steadying her as we trailed him down the gleaming hallway. We ended up in a small conference room again, the same kind they reserved for hard conversations. Dr. Patel sank into a chair opposite us, his hands folded neatly on the table, the dismantled smartwatch sitting like an accusation between us. "There's been some progress," he said carefully, his voice low and controlled, The kind of tone doctors used when they were trying to walk a patient's family through hell without letting them realize it until they were already there. Noah's stable. His vitals are strong. That's the good news. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Claudia sagged into the chair beside me, covering her mouth with one trembling hand. But there's more, Dr. Patel continued. His dark eyes pinned mine, unflinching. We've run multiple scans. There's no trauma to his brain, no congenital issues we can see. But the neurological patterns are disturbing. Artificial. I frowned. Artificial? What does that even mean? He leaned forward slightly, his hand steepled. His brain waves show a disturbance pattern consistent with external stimulation, specifically, induced low-frequency signals. We dismantled the smartwatch Noah was wearing when he collapsed. Inside the casing, hidden very carefully, was a low-frequency emitter tuned to frequencies known to disrupt neurological function. It was disguised, expertly crafted, but once we opened the casing, the device was clear. Claudia made a strangled sound, half gasp, half sob. I tightened my grip on her hand, but my own body was numb, frozen in a horror I couldn't fully comprehend. Dr. Patel didn't stop. He pushed forward, knowing we needed the full truth, however brutal. The device was designed to cause what we call non-epileptic seizures, neurological events induced by external stimuli rather than originating within the brain itself. This wasn't a random seizure. It wasn't an accident. It was deliberate. The device was meant to cause him to collapse. The room tilted slightly. I dug my heels into the floor to ground myself, to keep from losing what little control I still had. Who could have done that? Claudia whispered, her voice breaking on the last word. She already knew. We both did. But hearing it, making it real, was something else entirely. Dr. Patel hesitated for a beat, long enough to make the silence feel crushing. That's not for me to answer. But given the evidence, we contacted the authorities. The police are already on their way. They'll want to speak to you both, and to inspect the smartwatch themselves. I nodded stiffly. It wasn't even a decision. It was instinct. Noah needed protection, justice, vengeance, whatever it took. A soft knock at the door interrupted us, and a nurse poked her head in. Doctor? Detective Monroe is here. Send her in, Dr. Patel said, his voice still calm but weighted now with something heavier. The door opened wider, and a woman stepped inside. She was tall, early 40s maybe, with sharp eyes that missed nothing and a posture that radiated authority. She wore a dark blazer over practical slacks, a badge clipped to her belt. Mr. and Mrs. Harrington, she said, her voice cool but not unkind. I'm Detective Avery Monroe. I understand your son has been the victim of a possible assault involving a tampered device. Assault. Hearing the word spoken aloud ripped through me like shrapnel. This was real. It wasn't just a terrible accident. Someone had done this. To Noah. Yes, I rasped. Claudia squeezed my hand so tightly my knuckles whitened. Detective Monroe sat down across from us, pulling a small notepad from her pocket. I'll need to ask you a few questions. Anything you can remember about how your son received the smartwatch will be critical. I forced myself to breathe, to think. I described the Christmas morning chaos, the gift exchange, the moment Noah unwrapped the silver box from Rachel and Eleanor. I told her about the seconds before he collapsed. The laughter. The comments. The looks exchanged. Every detail I could wrench out of my exhausted mind. Detective Monroe's pen flew across the page, her expression never changing, but her eyes sharpening with each word. When I finished, she leaned back slightly. Thank you, she said. This helps a lot. We're going to need to bring in the individuals who gifted that device for questioning. If what you're describing is accurate, it points to intentional tampering, premeditated harm. Claudia let out a shuddering breath. I wrapped my arm tighter around her, drawing her closer against my side. I promise you, Detective Monroe said, her voice low and fierce, we'll get to the bottom of this. I nodded again, feeling the heavy thud of my heartbeat in my ears. I believed her. I had to, because standing still meant letting them get away with it. And I wasn't about to let that happen. Not after what they'd done to Noah. The hospital lobby looked different with police officers standing guard by the doors. What had once been a place of sterile calm now crackled with tension. People in scrubs and winter coats hurried past, casting curious glances at the small, unfolding storm centered around my family. I sat stiffly in one of the hard plastic chairs, Claudia at my side, her hand trembling in mine. The air around us felt brittle, like one wrong word would shatter everything. Detective Monroe worked quickly. Within an hour, She had separated Rachel and Eleanor into different interview rooms. I watched them being led away, neither putting up much of a fight. Rachel kept her head down, her hair falling like a curtain to shield her face. Eleanor, on the other hand, walked with her chin high, her fur-lined coat swinging around her like a cloak. She barely spared us a glance as she passed. Bryce remained in the waiting area, slumped on a bench with Logan huddled beside him. He looked lost, his hands clasped between his knees, his mouth moving silently as he rocked slightly. Logan clutched a worn stuffed rabbit to his chest, his face streaked with tears. Bryce hadn't known that much was obvious. His confusion and guilt hung around him like a fog. Detective Monroe returned to us a little while later, her notepad tucked away now, her mouth set in a tight line. "We're questioning both women separately," she said, keeping her voice low. "From what you've described and from what we've already gathered, there's clear probable cause. But I'm going to need you both to stay close. We may need you to formally identify items or clarify events." Claudia nodded numbly. I could feel the tremor in her arm even through her coat. A nurse approached then, touching Claudia's shoulder gently. "You can see your son now," she said. Her smile was kind but strained, as if she had seen too many families fall apart under these lights. Claudia shot to her feet, almost dragging me with her. We hurried through the maze of halls back toward the pediatric ICU. As we entered Noah's room, my heart cracked wide open. He lay in the hospital bed, tiny and fragile against the too large mattress, wires snaking from his arms and monitors beeping softly around him. His face was pale but peaceful, his chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm that soothed the sharpest edges of my panic. Claudia let out a ragged sob and rushed to his side, gathering his small hand carefully between hers. I followed more slowly, drinking in every detail of the soft flutter of his lashes, the faint color returning to his cheeks. My boy. My brave, resilient boy. I didn't know how long we sat there, just the three of us wrapped in the fragile stillness, when a soft knock interrupted us. Detective Monroe stepped into the room, a file tucked under her arm. Her face was carved from stone now, unreadable. "I have updates," she said quietly. Claudia kissed Noah's forehead and reluctantly pulled away, moving to stand beside me. Monroe didn't waste time. Eleanor refused to say much. Arrogant, dismissive. She all but laughed through the first part of the interview. But Rachel, she hesitated, her mouth tightening. Rachel broke. A cold shiver worked its way down my spine. She admitted it, Monroe said flatly. The smartwatch was deliberately modified. Eleanor and Rachel worked together to arrange it. The goal, according to Rachel, was to teach you a lesson. They resented you both. Resented your success, your perfect family, as she put it. Rachel's debts, her envy, it all festered. Claudia swayed slightly, and I steadied her. I felt my own knees threaten to buckle under the weight of it. They didn't plan for it to be this bad, at least not according to Rachel, Monroe continued. She claims it was supposed to be a scare. Something to ruin your Christmas morning. Shake things up. Not land Noah in the ICU. I clenched my jaw so hard it hurt. I spat. They call this a scare? I gestured helplessly to Noah's small, vulnerable body hooked up to monitors. Monroe's expression darkened. That smartwatch was rigged with precision. Whoever built it knew what they were doing. This wasn't an amateur prank. The emitter was tuned exactly to disrupt neurological function in a child. That's not a mistake. That's premeditated harm. Claudia covered her mouth, stifling a sob. I wrapped my arm around her again, anchoring both of us to the ground even as everything else tried to tear us loose. They're being booked, Monroe said. Rachel for assault with a deadly device and reckless endangerment. Eleanor for conspiracy and accessory to a felony. Given the deliberate nature of the act and the vulnerability of the victim, the charges are severe. I nodded slowly, my mind working sluggishly to absorb it all. The words felt clinical, sanitized, but the reality was anything but. My wife's family had tried to destroy ours. They had tried to hurt our son. And for what? Pride? Envy? Petty hatred dressed up as family obligation? You'll need to make formal statements, Monroe added, and we recommend filing for immediate restraining orders. I'll have the paperwork ready before you leave. Claudia looked at me, her eyes pleading. She didn't want to be the one to say it. I squeezed her hand. We'll do whatever it takes, I said grimly. Whatever we have to keep our son safe. Monroe nodded once, a sharp, respectful gesture. You're doing the right thing. She left us then, closing the door softly behind her. Claudia sank back into the chair beside Noah's bed, her hand trembling as she reached for his again. I knelt beside them, laying my hand gently over both of theirs. Our family had been fractured, shattered by betrayal that cut deeper than any knife. But looking at Noah, feeling the steady thump of life in his tiny wrist, I knew one thing for certain. They hadn't destroyed us. We were still here, still breathing, still fighting. And we would rebuild, no matter how long it took. Why? The question gnawed at me, a sharp, relentless thing that refused to let me rest even as Noah lay recovering just inches away. It wasn't enough to know what they had done. I needed to know why. Why would Rachel, family, and Eleanor, blood, set something so monstrous into motion? What darkness had festered so long, so deep, that they thought hurting a child was acceptable collateral? Detective Monroe met us again later that afternoon, standing just outside Noah's room with her arms folded tightly across her chest. Her face was as unreadable as ever, but when she spoke, her voice carried a weight even heavier than before. "You deserve to know what we learned," she said simply. Rachel's confession filled in the gaps. Claudia stood at my side, arms wrapped around herself as if holding her heart together. I could feel the tension radiating from her, the mixture of grief and guilt so thick it was hard to breathe. Monroe's eyes flickered to Claudia, softening slightly before she continued. "Rachel's resentment didn't start yesterday. It's been building for years. According to her, Eleanor played a large role in fueling it." I frowned, listening intently as Monroe pressed on. Eleanor always viewed Claudia as the chosen one, the successful daughter, the golden child who got everything right, she said. Rachel, on the other hand, struggled, financial problems, unstable relationships, poor career choices. But instead of owning her mistakes, she let the bitterness grow. Eleanor didn't soothe that bitterness. She fed it. Behind closed doors, she would pit Rachel against Claudia, undermining, belittling, encouraging Rachel to see herself as the victim in a story where Claudia always came out on top. Claudia's breath hitched painfully beside me. "But why hurt Noah?" I asked, my voice raw. "Why drag an innocent child into their twisted grudge?" Monroe hesitated, choosing her next words carefully. "Because hurting you directly would have been too obvious, too risky. And because in their minds, seeing your perfect little family fractured, even for a moment, was the ultimate revenge. It wasn't just about Claudia anymore. It was about tearing apart everything you built together." The truth landed like a body blow. I staggered under the weight of it, pressing a hand to the wall to steady myself. They hadn't seen Noah as a person. They had seen him as a tool, a way to hurt us where it mattered most. Rachel claimed, Monroe continued, her voice tight, that they never intended for Noah to be permanently harmed. She swore it was meant to be a scare, something dramatic enough to ruin your Christmas, to shake your image of a perfect life, but not this. Claudia let out a choked sound, something between a sob and a bitter laugh. I turned toward her, catching the way she wiped angrily at her cheeks. "A scare," she spat. "They think this is just a scare?" She gestured helplessly toward Noah's hospital bed, his small form still dwarfed by tubes and wires. "They nearly killed him. They could have killed him." "I know," Monroe said quietly. "And so will the judge." The rage that rose in me now was different from the wild, panicked fury of Christmas morning. This was colder, heavier. A leaden certainty that we would never forgive, never forget. "I should have seen it," Claudia whispered, shaking her head. "I should have known." "You couldn't have known," I said, stepping forward, placing my hands firmly on her shoulders. "They didn't just hide it from you. They weaponized your trust. That's not on you." Claudia looked up at me, her eyes hollow, searching for something I wasn't sure I could give. Forgiveness, maybe, or absolution. But how could you forgive yourself for trusting monsters? Monroe cleared her throat softly. "There's one more thing you should know," she said. "Financial records show that Rachel was under immense pressure. She had racked up serious debt again, gambling, from what we can tell." "Claudia, you bailed her out once already, didn't you?" Claudia nodded slowly, her face crumpling with fresh hurt. "A few years ago. She begged me not to tell anyone." "She never forgave you for it," Monroe said bluntly. "Instead of feeling grateful, she felt humiliated. She saw it as proof that you were better, that you could fix problems she couldn't." I tightened my arms around Claudia as her body sagged with the weight of it all. "So this was revenge," I said quietly. "Over pride, over jealousy." Monroe nodded. "Pure, ugly resentment. Nothing more." We stood there for a long moment, the fluorescent lights humming overhead, the soft beep of Noah's monitors reminding us where the real battle had been fought and won. He was still here, still breathing. "Thank you," I said finally, my voice hoarse, "for finding the truth." Monroe nodded once more and left us alone, her steps brisk and sure. I turned back toward Noah's bed, pulling Claudia with me. We sat again, side by side, watching the steady rise and fall of his chest. The chaos outside the hospital walls, arrests, charges, restraining orders, that could wait. For now, all that mattered was right here. I don't know how we come back from this, Claudia said, her voice trembling. One day at a time, I said. One breath at a time. She leaned into me, her head resting against my shoulder, and for the first time since this nightmare began, I let myself believe that maybe, just maybe, we could survive it. Because they had tried to destroy us. And they had failed. And from the ashes of their malice, we would build something stronger. The first time Noah's eyes fluttered open, it was as if the entire world snapped back into color. For a moment, he looked confused, his gaze darting around the sterile hospital room, struggling to place where he was. Then he saw us, Claudia clutching his hand, me sitting stiffly at his side. And a weak smile lifted the corners of his mouth. Relief slammed into me so hard I had to look away for a second, just to breathe through it. Hey, buddy, I said, leaning closer, forcing my voice to stay steady even though my heart was splintering inside my chest. You gave us quite a scare. Noah's fingers twitched in Claudia's hand. His lips moved, dry and cracked, forming a single, croaky word. Thirsty. Claudia let out a watery laugh, fumbling for the cup of ice water on the tray. She guided the straw to his mouth, her hand shaking. Noah sipped weakly, and when he finished, he sank back into the pillows with a small, exhausted sigh. He's going to be okay, Dr. Patel had said earlier that morning after another round of tests. There's no permanent neurological damage. He'll need rest, careful monitoring for a while, but he's expected to make a full recovery. And yet, recovery was not just measured in brainwaves and blood pressure. Some wounds weren't visible on scans. Some left no scars on skin but carved valleys through trust, safety, the very things a family is supposed to be built on. Claudia and I stayed by Noah's side every second we were allowed. We played his favorite movies on the hospital TV, bringing little bursts of normalcy into a place that smelled of antiseptic and sadness. We told silly stories, colored with him, held his hand when the nurses came in with 4 drips and blood pressure cuffs. Anything to stitch the broken pieces of our lives back together. Rachel and Eleanor remained in custody. Detective Monroe kept us updated, though I barely listened half the time. They were being arraigned separately. Bail was being debated. Restraining orders were moving forward. Lawyers were already circling like vultures. None of it mattered to me the way Noah's slow, steady breathing did. But the damage they'd caused wasn't going to vanish with a few signatures and court dates. It bled into everything. Into Claudia's restless nights, her sudden flinches when hospital doors banged too loudly. Into my own constant need to check the locks twice, to stare too long at strangers, wondering who might be hiding knives behind polite smiles. The night before Noah's discharge, Claudia and I sat curled together on the too small hospital couch, Noah sleeping peacefully for the first time in days. A light snow had begun falling again outside the window, tiny white flakes against the city's black skyline. We can't stay here, Claudia whispered suddenly, her voice small in the dark. I turned toward her. At the hospital? She shook her head. In the apartment. That place, it's ruined now, Miles. Every corner, every memory. I don't want Noah to walk through those doors and remember what happened. I don't want us to live under that shadow. I nodded slowly. I had already been thinking the same thing, even if I hadn't said it aloud. Our home had become a crime scene in our minds. A place where trust had been poisoned. We'll find somewhere new, I said. Somewhere better. Her hand found mine in the dark, squeezing tightly. Together. Always. It took 6 months to untangle ourselves from the penthouse. Realtors, lawyers, endless paperwork. Selling the place felt almost ceremonial, like shedding a skin that no longer fit. We packed our memories into boxes, carefully choosing what to carry into the next chapter and what to leave behind like a bad dream. We found a small house in Brooklyn, not as grand, not as sleek, but alive with warmth. A battered porch, creaky floors, a backyard where Noah could run when he was ready, a blank canvas for new memories. Noah bounced back faster than either of us expected. Kids have a resilience adults can only dream of. Within a few months, he was back in school, playing soccer with his friends, telling jokes that made no sense but left Claudia and me laughing anyway. Sometimes, I would catch him touching his wrist where the smartwatch had been, a quick, subconscious movement, like a phantom itch. It made my chest ache every time. Therapy helped. Family sessions where we talked about fear, about betrayal, about trust, and how to build it again. Noah was quieter at first, but slowly he opened up, letting the words out piece by piece until the weight of them wasn't quite so heavy. Claudia struggled more privately. I would find her standing in Noah's doorway late at night, watching him sleep with tears tracking silently down her face. She blamed herself in ways she couldn't even articulate, no matter how many times I told her none of it was her fault. I carried my own guilt too. Guilt for not seeing it sooner, for not protecting my family better, for trusting people who had worn family faces while hiding poisonous hearts. But with every day that passed in that little Brooklyn house, healing took root. It wasn't fast. It wasn't easy. Some days were 2 steps forward, 1 back. But it was real. The legal battles dragged on longer than we cared to follow. Rachel pleaded guilty eventually, trying to avoid a harsher sentence. Eleanor fought harder, her lawyers painting her as some clueless bystander. But Detective Monroe was relentless, and so were we. In the end, justice came, and not perfectly, but enough. Enough to close the door on that chapter of our lives. One morning, I woke up to find Claudia humming softly in the kitchen, Noah building a Lego spaceship at the table, sunlight streaming through the kitchen window. For a moment, I just stood there, letting the simple, precious scene imprint itself into my bones. We had been broken, but we had not been beaten. We were still standing, still loving, still choosing each other every single day. And sometimes, that's all a miracle really is. The snow fell soft and lazy over Brooklyn that Christmas morning, the flakes drifting down like tiny whispered promises. I stood at the window of our new home, a modest 2-story with chipped paint and a squeaky front door, and watched the neighborhood transform into a quiet, glittering world. For the first time in a long while, my chest didn't feel tight. The ache of what had been lost was still there, a scar that would never fully fade, but it no longer defined the air we breathed. Behind me, laughter rang out, light, real, filling every dusty corner of the house with something far stronger than any bitterness we had left behind. I turned to see Noah, perched on a wobbly wooden chair, stringing popcorn garland with his tongue poking out in fierce concentration. Claudia hovered over a tray of gingerbread cookies in the kitchen, her hair pulled into a messy bun, flour dusting her cheek like a careless kiss. There were no expensive gifts stacked under the tree this year. No glittering, store-bought perfection arranged to impress guests who would only ever look for flaws. Instead, a crooked, second-hand tree stood proudly in the corner, adorned with paper snowflakes, popsicle stick ornaments, and a string of blinking lights that worked more often than not. It wasn't polished, but it was ours. It was real. "Hey, Dad," Noah called, holding up his popcorn string triumphantly. "Think this'll go all the way around the tree?" I laughed, the sound feeling strange and wonderful in my chest. "Might have to make a few more, buddy. But it looks awesome." He beamed at the praise, his face so bright, so alive, that my throat tightened. Watching him, healthy, happy, mischievous, was like seeing 1,000 prayers answered in the shape of a single boy. Claudia turned from the oven, hands on her hips, surveying the organized chaos with mock severity. "If anyone eats more popcorn than they string, you're on dish duty for the rest of the day." Mom." Noah groaned dramatically, stuffing another handful into his mouth before she could enforce her rule. Claudia laughed, throwing a dish towel at him, and he ducked under the table, giggling. I moved to join them, feeling a simple, profound gratitude with every step, the kind that fills you up from the inside out until you think you might float. Later, we sat cross-legged around the tree, exchanging small, thoughtful gifts. A hand-knitted scarf Claudia made for me. A Lego kit Noah had saved up for with his allowance to give to his mom. A photo album Claudia and Noah had secretly filled with snapshots of the past year, our first family barbecue in the backyard, Noah's first soccer game after the hospital, the day we hung the battered, "Welcome Home" sign over the front door. Each page was a reminder, we hadn't just survived. We had lived. We had rebuilt. When it was Noah's turn to open his last present, he hesitated, his fingers hovering over the wrapping. I recognized the uncertainty flickering across his face and leaned forward. "It's okay," I said softly. "There's nothing hidden. Nothing bad. Just love, buddy." He looked at me, searching my face, and then nodded. Slowly, carefully, he peeled back the paper to reveal a simple wooden box, no bigger than a shoebox. Inside was a hand-carved music box I had found at a small local shop, a tiny winter village that spun in slow circles when you wound the key, playing a soft, tinkling version of Silent Night. Noah turned the key, and the music filled the room, sweet and a little off-key, but perfect in its imperfection. He watched the village spin, the little figures skating on a frozen pond, the houses dusted with pretend snow. "I love it," he said finally, his voice thick with emotion he couldn't quite name yet. Claudia wrapped her arms around him, pulling him into her lap, and I leaned in too, enveloping them both. For a long time, we just sat there, letting the music play, letting the moment soak into our bones. Outside, the world kept spinning. People hurried through last-minute errands. Somewhere, car horns honked. Life, messy and imperfect, carried on. But inside our little house, time stood still. We didn't need grandeur. We didn't need expensive watches or towering penthouses. We needed this: safety, laughter, love built on real foundations. No shadows darkened our doorway now. Rachel and Eleanor were relics of another life, one we had buried with care and without ceremony. We carried the lessons they forced on us, the importance of boundaries, the value of vigilance, but we no longer carried their cruelty. As the music wound down and silence settled softly around us again, I realized something profound. Sometimes you don't find the right family. Sometimes you build it. From the wreckage. From the broken pieces. From the stubborn refusal to let the darkness win. Claudia looked up at me then, her eyes shining, and I saw the woman I had fallen in love with all over again, stronger now, scarred but unbowed. I kissed the top of Noah's head, then leaned across to kiss her forehead, feeling her warmth seep into me. "I love you," I whispered. "I love you too," she murmured. Noah grinned up at us, still small, still fragile in some ways, but already so much stronger than any of us had a right to expect. "I love you more," he said with a mischievous gleam, and we all laughed. The snow kept falling outside, blanketing the world in clean, quiet white. Inside, surrounded by the people who mattered most, I knew this Christmas, this simple, battered, beautiful Christmas, was the start of something better than anything we had ever had before. Not the life we planned, but the life we fought for. And finally, the life we deserved.